A Queen's Love, Victoria and Albert. December 14th, 1861. Windsor Castle. The most powerful woman in the world is kneeling beside a deathbed, watching her husband of 21 years slip away. Prince Albert is only 42. Queen Victoria is about to become the most famous widow in history. She'll wear black for the next 40 years, never wear her crown in public again, have his shaving water brought steaming hot every morning until she dies. This isn't just a love story. It's the story of how one woman's grief literally changed the world. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink. We're about to explore one of history's greatest love stories and its heartbreaking end. If you enjoy falling asleep to history and waking up smarter, hit that subscribe button. And I love hearing from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you in bed already? Commuting home? Walking the dog? I love knowing we're sharing this story together across the world tonight. October 1839, Windsor Castle. 18-year-old Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 2 years. She's barely 5 feet tall, but commands an empire where the sun never sets. Today, her first cousin arrives from Germany, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria takes one look at him walking up those castle steps, and, boom, she's done for. Here's what she wrote in her journal that night. Albert is extremely handsome. His hair is about the same colour as mine. His eyes are large and blue, and he has a beautiful nose and a very sweet mouth. Girl was smitten. Albert isn't just pretty though. He's brilliant, serious-minded, deeply principled. Everything young Victoria isn't, which is exactly what she needs. She's impulsive, hot-tempered, stubborn as anything. Albert is calm, thoughtful, diplomatic. They spend 5 days together. 5 days, that's it. By the time he leaves, Victoria knows she's going to marry him. But here's the thing. She has to propose to him. Royal protocol. The Queen proposes to her subjects, not the other way round, and she's terrified he'll say no. Can you imagine? The Queen of England, nervous about asking someone to marry her? February 10th, 1840. The wedding. Victoria later described their wedding night as bliss beyond belief. These two were absolutely crazy about each other, physically, emotionally, intellectually. But this isn't just some royal fairy tale. Albert becomes Victoria's true partner, her co-ruler in everything but name. He reforms the royal household, promotes education and the arts, basically runs Britain while Victoria handles the ceremonies. She trusts his judgment completely, something she'd never done with anyone before. For 21 years, they're inseparable. 9 children together, though Victoria finds pregnancy absolutely miserable and calls babies that terrible frog-like action. By 1861, they're both 42. Their life feels settled, secure. Albert has shaped modern Britain. The Great Exhibition, educational reforms, turning the monarchy into something respectable again. Victoria adores him more than ever. She still writes in her diary about how handsome he is, how much she misses him when he's gone even for a few hours. Their partnership works because they balance each other perfectly. She's the fire, he's the steady flame. She makes quick decisions, he thinks them through. She rules with emotion, he governs with logic. They're two halves of one whole. Then November 1861 arrives. Albert starts feeling unwell. Stomach pains, exhaustion, general malaise. The royal physicians don't really know what they're doing. Medical knowledge in 1861 is pretty limited. They're probably making him worse with their treatments. Albert keeps working though. He's always been a workaholic, always pushing himself. Victoria notices he's tired, but Albert is often tired. The man carries the weight of an empire on his shoulders. She's not worried yet. Why would she be? Albert is only 42. They have decades ahead of them, or so she thinks. Late November. Albert is getting worse, much worse. The physicians are whispering about typhoid fever. Victoria starts to panic. She's never had to imagine life without Albert. He's been her anchor, her advisor, her best friend, her lover, her everything for 21 years. The idea that he might actually... No, she won't let herself think it. Albert is strong. Albert is young. Albert will recover. He has to, because without Albert, Victoria doesn't know how to be queen. Without Albert, she doesn't know how to be herself. December is coming, and with it, the end of everything she's ever known. The earth shatters. Albert's final days. November 1861. Windsor Castle. Something's wrong with Prince Albert. He's 42 years old, should be in his prime, but he can barely get through a day without collapsing. Stomach pains that double him over. Exhaustion that sleep can't cure. The royal physicians huddle in corners, whispering about typhoid, about fevers, about treatments that aren't working. But Victoria refuses to see it. This is the man who's been her everything for 21 years. He can't be dying. He simply can't. Watch Victoria during these final weeks. She's like someone trying to hold back the tide with her bare hands. Every morning she convinces herself Albert looks better. Every time he manages to smile or eat a few bites, she declares him recovering. She arranges his pillows constantly, brings him his favourite books, talks about plans for Christmas, for next year's projects. The servants exchange glances. The doctors shake their heads. But Victoria builds these elaborate fantasies where everything will be fine, where love can overcome anything, even death. The physicians are helpless, and they know it. This is 1861. They don't understand germs. They can't see inside the human body. They prescribe bleedings that weaken Albert further, hot baths that exhaust him, medicines that probably do more harm than good. Dr. William Jenner, the royal physician, suspects typhoid but can't be certain. They watch Albert fade day by day, adjusting treatments that aren't treatments at all, just desperate attempts to do something, anything, while the prince consort slips away despite their best efforts. While Albert lies dying, everyone suddenly remembers how much he's given Britain. The Great Exhibition of 1851. That was Albert's vision. Educational reform, arts and sciences funding, modernising the royal household. Albert did that. He essentially ran the government while Victoria handled the ceremonial stuff. He was the brains behind the throne, the steady hand guiding an empire. And now he's disappearing, leaving this enormous gap that no one knows how to fill. Britain is about to lose its unofficial Prime Minister, and they don't even realise it yet. December 13th. Albert can barely speak. Victoria sits beside his bed for hours, holding his hand, talking to him even when he doesn't respond. She reads him letters from their children. She describes the winter garden outside his window. She tells him about the Christmas preparations, as if there will be a Christmas to celebrate. The blue room at Windsor feels like a tomb already. Curtains drawn, whispered conversations, everyone tiptoeing around the inevitable. Albert drifts in and out of consciousness, each return a little fainter than the last. December 14th, 10:50 p.m. Albert takes his final breath with Victoria kneeling beside his bed. She kisses his forehead and calls his name, but he's gone. The most powerful woman in the world becomes a widow in that instant. The silence is incredible. No dramatic death scene, no final words, just stillness. 21 years of marriage, 9 children, a partnership that redefined monarchy, ended in a quiet room at Windsor Castle. Victoria stays there for hours, unable to accept that the man who was her entire world has simply stopped breathing. The castle feels dead. Servants creep through hallways, speaking in whispers. Nobody knows what to do. How do you console a queen? How do you replace someone irreplaceable? Victoria's screams echo through Windsor's corridors. She refuses to leave Albert's bedside, refuses to make decisions, refuses to believe this is real. Her ministers wait anxiously in London. The empire needs its monarch, but their monarch has become something else entirely. A woman broken so completely that putting her back together seems impossible, and maybe she doesn't want to be put back together. That's when it hits Victoria. The brutal mathematics of widowhood. Yesterday she was Albert's beloved wife, his partner, half of something whole and powerful. Today she's a 42-year-old woman, alone with 9 children and an empire to run. Yesterday every decision was ours. Today every decision is hers. The woman who never wanted to rule without him now faces 40 more years on the throne, solo. She doesn't know it yet, but she'll spend those 40 years proving that some kinds of love never end, even when they probably should. Immortalizing grief, transformations and traditions. December 15th, 1861. The morning after Albert dies. Victoria wakes up, and for one blessed second, maybe she forgets. Then reality crashes back like a physical blow. Her beloved is gone forever. What happens next isn't just grief. It's the complete reconstruction of a life, a household, an entire empire around the absence of one man. Victoria doesn't just mourn Albert. She builds a religion around his memory, and everyone around her becomes an unwilling worshipper in her dark, endless temple of perpetual crushing sorrow. The sounds coming from Windsor Castle that first week, they're unlike anything the servants have ever heard. Victoria screams, not crying, screaming, raw animal sounds of pain that echo through the corridors. She sobs until she can't breathe, refuses to eat, won't leave her rooms. For days, she sees no one except her eldest daughter and a few terrified servants. The most powerful woman in the world has become completely, utterly broken, and she doesn't care who knows it. This is grief without dignity, without restraint. But here's where Victoria's grief gets systematic. She commands that Albert's room, the blue room where he died, must never change, not one single thing. Fresh flowers daily, his clothes laid out each evening, hot shaving water brought every morning for 40 years, his pocket watch wound, his favourite food served to an empty chair at dinner. Think about that, 40 years of setting a place for a dead man. Victoria transforms their bedroom into a shrine where she worships at the altar of what was. The morning after Albert's funeral, Victoria puts on black, deep, unrelenting black. No colour, no ornamentation, just black silk and jet jewellery. She's 42 years old. She will never wear another colour again. 40 years of black. Think about that commitment. Every morning for the rest of her life, she chooses grief over hope, memory over possibility. The most fashionable woman in the empire becomes a walking monument to loss. Her mourning clothes aren't just about sadness, they're a statement, a refusal to move forward. The entire household follows suit. If the Queen mourns, everyone mourns. Servants dress in black. Celebrations are forbidden. Laughter feels wrong. Christmas becomes a day of memorial services instead of joy. Albert had brought Christmas trees to Britain. Now Victoria makes Christmas about death instead of birth. Her children grow up in a house where joy is betrayal, where happiness means forgetting Papa. The royal nurseries echo with whispers instead of laughter. Grief becomes the family religion, and Victoria is its high priestess. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Royal mourning usually lasts months, maybe a year, but Victoria creates something unprecedented, permanent grief, as a form of power. She commissions photographs of herself in widow's weeds. These images spread across the empire, fixing her identity as the eternal widow. She refuses to wear her crown in public, appearing instead in black, with Albert's portrait. The message is clear. She's not just a queen who lost her husband. She's Albert's widow who happens to rule an empire. And the people, they're watching. Every detail of Victoria's mourning gets reported in newspapers, copied in magazines, discussed in parlours across Britain. Her black dresses become fashion. Her mourning jewellery starts trends. Her rituals become templates. If the Queen sets Albert's place at dinner, maybe widows everywhere should do the same. If she keeps his room unchanged, maybe that's what love looks like. Victoria's personal grief is becoming a cultural blueprint, a new way to perform loss that will reshape how an entire society thinks about death. But this is just the beginning. Victoria's mourning will last 4 decades, outlasting governments, wars, and social revolutions. Her grief will become more famous than her reign, more influential than her policies. She's about to transform an entire empire's relationship with death, fashion, and the meaning of devotion. Next time, we'll see how Victoria's private shrine becomes a public obsession, how her mourning dress becomes $1 million industry, and how one woman's refusal to heal wounds an entire nation. Sweet dreams, echoes of the past, an empire in mourning. Here's what happens when a queen's personal grief becomes a national obsession. Victoria wasn't just mourning Albert anymore. She was teaching an entire empire how to mourn, and business was booming. Black fabric shops couldn't keep up with demand. Mourning jewellery makers worked overtime crafting rings with hair compartments, brooches shaped like weeping willows. Every proper household needed black bordered stationery, mourning cards, special mourning fans. Victoria had accidentally created Britain's first grief economy. Death was becoming profitable. The rules got insane. Not just black clothes, but which shade of black for which stage of grief. Jet black for deep mourning, slightly less black for half mourning. Widows needed special mourning caps, mourning gloves, mourning parasols. A woman mourning her husband, 2 years minimum. Her parents, 1 year. Second cousin, 6 months, but only if you were close. Fashion magazines published mourning etiquette guides, thicker than novels. One wrong accessory, and society would whisper. Victoria had turned grief into a competitive sport nobody wanted to lose. And here's the twisted part. Families went broke trying to mourn properly. Working class mothers choosing between food and black dresses because not having mourning clothes meant social death. Children in factories sewing mourning veils 12 hours a day. Entire industries pivoted to serve grief. Photographers specializing in post-mortem portraits. Jewelers crafting lockets for hair samples. Victoria's personal trauma had spawned a grief industrial complex that fed on everyone else's losses. She'd made mourning fashionable, and fashion had made mourning expensive. But Victoria herself? Still hiding. Still refusing to show her face in public. Parliament opened year after year with an empty throne. State dinners cancelled. Royal ceremonies reduced to bare minimum. Her crown literally gathering dust while she wore her widow's cap. The most powerful woman in the world had made herself invisible, and people were starting to notice. If the Queen won't be Queen, then what exactly are we paying for? The whispers were getting louder. The questions more pointed. Victoria's grief was becoming Britain's political crisis. Newspapers started getting nasty. Political cartoons showed empty thrones, cobweb-covered crowns. Republican movements gained momentum for the first time in decades. If monarchy is just ceremony, and the monarch won't perform, maybe Britain didn't need a monarch at all. Victoria's ministers panicked. They begged her to make appearances, to wear her crown, to remember her duties. She ignored them. In her mind, Albert was still dead, which meant nothing else mattered. But her empire was starting to wonder if she mattered. The irony was brutal. Victoria's mourning had made grief fashionable, created entire industries around death and remembrance. But it was also making the monarchy seem irrelevant. People were mourning better than their queen was reigning. They had elaborate funeral rituals, perfect mourning etiquette, beautiful grief jewellery, while their actual ruler sulked in Windsor, talking to portraits and sleeping with dead husbands' clothes. The student had surpassed the teacher. The empire was performing monarchy better than the monarch. By 1870, the question wasn't whispered anymore. Newspapers printed it outright. Does Britain need a monarchy? if the monarch refuses to be seen. Victoria had been absent for nearly a decade. A generation was growing up without seeing their queen in person. Republican rallies drew crowds. Politicians openly debated abolishing the crown. Victoria's grief had inadvertently triggered the biggest constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. Her personal trauma was threatening the very institution she was supposed to protect. The woman who'd started a grief revolution was discovering that revolutions have consequences. Her mourning had transformed British society, created new industries, new social rules, new ways of processing loss. But it had also created new doubts about power, duty, and whether love for the dead should override responsibility to the living. Victoria's 40-year mourning period wasn't just changing how people grieved, it was changing how they thought about authority itself. The widow queen had become her own worst enemy, defying time, the eternal widow. By 1867, Victoria had been mourning Albert for 6 years. 6 years of black dresses, empty chairs at dinner, that same photograph of his corpse beside her bed. The British public was getting restless. Parliament opened without their queen, again. State ceremonies happened without the crown, again. Politicians whispered dangerous words. Maybe Britain didn't need a monarchy after all. Maybe this grieving woman in Windsor Castle had outlived her usefulness. Victoria heard every whisper, and she didn't care. Her grief was bigger than their politics. The Republican movement was gaining steam. Newspapers printed cartoons showing Victoria as a hermit, hiding in Windsor Castle while her empire crumbled. What use is a queen who won't be seen? They asked. Fair question, honestly. She collected her salary, lived in luxury, but refused to do the job. Charles Bradlaugh, a radical politician, openly questioned the monarchy's value. His speeches drew crowds. People nodded along. If Victoria wouldn't work, why should they pay for her? The criticism stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Her ministers begged her to return to public life. Benjamin Disraeli, her favourite prime minister, tried charm and flattery. William Gladstone used logic and constitutional duty. Nothing worked. Victoria had found something more powerful than their arguments. She had found martyrdom. Every time they pressured her to appear in public, she reminded them of her sacrifice. I am a broken woman, she'd write. My beloved Albert would want me to preserve his memory. She'd turned grief into armour. Political armour that somehow worked. Here's where it gets weird. Instead of destroying her, the resistance made her stronger. Think about it. Victoria refused to play by anyone else's rules, even the rules of monarchy. She created her own role, the eternal widow, the woman who loved too deeply to ever love again. British society, obsessed with mourning rituals anyway, began to see her differently, not as a shirking queen, but as a woman of incredible devotion, a woman who understood loss. Everyone had buried someone. Victoria just buried deeper. By the 1880s, something remarkable happened. Victoria's image shifted from pathetic recluse to romantic heroine. Popular magazines published stories about her endless love for Albert. Poets wrote verses about her faithfulness. Young women studied her mourning rituals like a how-to guide for proper devotion. She became the poster child for Victorian womanhood, devoted, constant, pure. Her black dresses weren't signs of depression anymore. They were symbols of unshakable love. The same grief that nearly destroyed her monarchy had somehow saved it. Victoria was still working behind the scenes, of course. She read every government document, met with ministers privately, shaped policy through letters and private audiences. She just wouldn't be seen doing it. This invisible governance actually increased her mystique. She became the woman behind the curtain, pulling strings while draped in black crepe. Her golden jubilee in 1887 proved her popularity had returned. Crowds cheered for their black-clad queen. They loved her now, loved her grief, her consistency, her refusal to change for anyone. The ripple effects were massive. Victoria's extended mourning normalised lifelong widowhood for ordinary women. If the Queen could mourn for 26 years and counting, surely a shopkeeper's widow could mourn for 5 or 10 or forever. Mourning jewellery sales skyrocketed. Black fabric became Britain's unofficial uniform. Death photography boomed as families imitated Victoria's bedside portraits of Albert. She'd accidentally created a culture where grief wasn't something to overcome, it was something to perform. Something to perfect, something to wear like a badge of honour. Victoria had defied time itself. While everyone else moved forward, she stood still, frozen in December 1861, and somehow, impossibly, the world came to admire her for it. She'd transformed weakness into strength, isolation into power, personal grief into public identity. The woman who refused to stop mourning had become immortal in her mourning. By the late 1880s, she wasn't just Queen Victoria anymore. She was Victoria the devoted, Victoria the faithful, Victoria who loved her husband so much she'd rather die than forget him. That was her victory. Memorials and monuments. Victoria's tributes to Albert. Within months of Albert's death, Victoria embarked on the most ambitious memorial campaign in British history. This wasn't just grief, this was architectural worship. She commissioned monuments, statues, halls, entire buildings dedicated to Albert's memory. The Albert Memorial in Hyde Park would cost a fortune. The Royal Albert Hall, streets renamed, towns renamed. Victoria was literally reshaping the landscape of Britain around her dead husband's legacy. And here's the thing, she controlled every detail, every inscription, every sculpture, every dedication ceremony. Albert's memory wouldn't be left to chance. The Albert Memorial alone took 10 years to build. Gothic Revival masterpiece, 180 feet tall, covered in marble and gold. Albert sits reading under an ornate canopy, surrounded by allegorical figures representing the continents, the sciences, the arts. Victoria approved every sketch, every carving. She wanted Albert portrayed as the perfect prince, intellectual, noble, eternally youthful. The memorial cost what would be millions today. Parliament complained about the expense. Victoria didn't care. This was her temple to Albert, and she would make Britain worship at it, whether they wanted to or not. Victoria didn't just build monuments, she became Albert's official biographer. She published books about his early life, edited collections of his speeches, controlled what newspapers could print about him. Anyone wanting to write about Albert had to get her approval first. She rewrote history to make Albert more perfect than he'd ever been in life. His occasional bad moods, deleted. His political mistakes, never mentioned. His human flaws, erased completely. Victoria was crafting a saint, not remembering a man. And if you suggested otherwise, you were finished at court. These memorials served Victoria's purposes perfectly. Every statue of Albert reinforced that she had been his chosen partner. Every inscription mentioned their perfect marriage. Every dedication ceremony put Victoria centre stage as the grieving widow who understood Albert best. The monuments weren't just about remembering Albert. They were about cementing Victoria's position as his eternal consort. She used Albert's death to make herself untouchable. Who could criticise the devoted widow? Who could question the woman preserving her husband's noble legacy? It was brilliant political theatre disguised as love. But Victoria expected her children to participate in this cult of Albert's memory. She demanded they visit his memorials regularly, speak of him with reverence, name their children after him. Family dinners became lectures about Papa's wisdom. Holidays were sombre remembrances of what Albert would have wanted. Victoria compared every one of her children to Albert, and they always fell short. Your dear Papa would never have done that. Albert was so much more thoughtful at your age. Her children grew up competing with a ghost they could never defeat. The friction was worst with Bertie, her eldest son and heir. Victoria had always found Bertie disappointing compared to Albert's intellectual brilliance. After Albert's death, this disappointment curdled into something closer to hatred. Bertie was everything Albert wasn't: pleasure-seeking, social, uninterested in serious study. Victoria blamed Bertie's wild behaviour for weakening Albert's health before his death. She couldn't forgive her own son for being alive while Albert was dead. Bertie felt it: the constant criticism, the impossible comparisons, the sense that his mother wished he'd died instead. Victoria kept Bertie frozen in permanent adolescence for decades. While other princes his age were given real responsibilities, Bertie was excluded from government papers, denied meaningful royal duties, treated like a child well into his 40s. She wouldn't let him grow into the role Albert had filled as her partner and advisor. Instead, she gave that emotional space entirely to Albert's memory. Bertie could party and travel and marry, but he could never matter to his mother the way Albert had. The future King of England was essentially unemployed because his father's ghost held his job. Victoria's other children suffered differently but deeply. Her daughters were expected to remain unmarried to care for their grieving mother, or if they did marry, to live nearby and visit constantly. Her youngest, Beatrice, was essentially held hostage. Victoria refused to speak to her for months when she got engaged. The royal children grew up in a house haunted by a man most of them barely remembered, where joy was considered disrespectful and moving forward was betrayal. Victoria's monuments to Albert became monuments to her children's stunted lives. In the shadow of the dead, Victoria's children. Imagine being 9 years old and having your mother tell you that you killed your father. That's what happened to Bertie, Victoria's eldest son, December 1861. Albert's barely cold in his grave, and Victoria's already decided who to blame. Not the typhoid fever, not the medieval medical treatments, her own child, because Bertie had gotten into some trouble at Cambridge, a scandal involving an actress. Victoria convinced herself that Albert's worry over this killed him, so she looked at her 19-year-old son and saw a murderer. The thing about grief this intense: it doesn't stay contained. It spreads like poison through everything it touches. Victoria had 9 children, and every single one of them paid the price for Albert's death. Think about that for a second. 9 kids who lost their father, then effectively lost their mother too. She was physically there, sure, but emotionally, she checked out completely. The woman who remained was this hollow shell, obsessed with a dead man's memory, demanding everyone else worship at the same altar. Bertie got it worst. Victoria froze him out for decades. Wouldn't let him see government papers. Wouldn't give him any real responsibilities. Here's a guy who should be learning how to rule an empire, and instead his mother treats him like he's permanently grounded. She kept comparing him to Albert constantly. Your father would be ashamed. Albert was so much better at your age. Imagine hearing that every day for 40 years. The future King of England, walking around feeling like a disappointing failure because he wasn't his dead father. The daughters had their own special hell. Victoria decided that at least one of them had to stay with her at all times. Like, forever. They called them home daughters, which sounds sweet until you realise what it actually meant. These grown women couldn't get married, couldn't have their own lives, couldn't make their own choices. They had to sit with their grieving mother, day after day, listening to her talk about Albert like he'd just stepped out of the room. Princess Alice tried to escape by marrying young. Smart move, honestly. But it's Beatrice who really breaks your heart. Victoria's youngest daughter. She spent 27 years as her mother's emotional support system. When Beatrice finally found someone she wanted to marry, Victoria stopped speaking to her. Complete silence for months. A grown woman getting the silent treatment from her mother because she dared to fall in love. Victoria only agreed to the marriage when Beatrice promised to stay living at home afterward. Even with a husband, Beatrice remained trapped in her mother's grief. Here's what gets me about this whole situation. These kids never really got to mourn their father properly. They were too busy managing their mother's breakdown. Alice, who was only 18 when Albert died, basically became Victoria's caregiver. She had to handle all the funeral arrangements while Victoria collapsed completely. So Alice never got to be the grieving daughter. She had to be the adult in the room while her actual mother fell apart. That's not mourning. That's trauma passing itself down through generations. The pressure to live up to Albert's memory was crushing. Victoria had built this image of him as perfect, this saint, who could do no wrong. How do you compete with that? How do you be a good enough son or daughter when you're being measured against someone who's been elevated to God status? Every mistake they made got compared to their father's supposed perfection. Every achievement got dismissed because Albert would have done it better. They were children trying to earn love from a mother who'd already given all her love to a ghost. The saddest part? Some of these kids barely remembered Albert when he was alive. The younger ones especially, but they still had to pretend to worship his memory, had to participate in their mother's endless memorial services and anniversary mourning rituals. They were performing grief for a man they hardly knew, sacrificing their own happiness to keep their mother's obsession alive. That's not honouring the dead. That's letting the dead control the living. And 9 children paid that price for 40 long years. Legacy of a Queen. Understanding Victoria's grief. In January 1901, Queen Victoria lay dying at Osborne House, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She was 81 years old and had worn black for nearly 40 years. Even as death approached, she clutched a photograph of Albert and wore his wedding ring alongside her own. The woman who had ruled an empire for 63 years whispered Albert's name with her final breath. Her long vigil was ending. For decades, people have debated the nature of Victoria's endless mourning. Was it genuine grief that consumed her, or something more calculated? The truth probably lies somewhere between. Victoria's letters reveal raw, devastating pain that feels utterly real. But her grief also became a tool of power. It made her untouchable, beyond criticism, sacred in her suffering. Who could demand a grieving widow return to normal life? Her mourning protected her from expectations she didn't want to meet. Modern psychologists have analysed Victoria's behaviour through contemporary lenses. What we might now call complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. Her inability to process Albert's death normally, her obsessive preservation of his belongings, her refusal to imagine life without him, these weren't just Victorian customs taken to extremes. They were patterns that suggest deep psychological wounds that never healed. Victoria may have been trapped in the acute phase of grief for 40 years, unable to move forward. The public knew Victoria as the stoic mourning queen, forever in black, dignified in her sorrow. But her private reality was messier. She had explosive rages when servants moved Albert's things. She wept hysterically on anniversaries. She wrote passionate letters about longing to join him in death. The composed widow the world saw was a careful performance. Privately, she remained that screaming woman who had collapsed beside Albert's deathbed in 1861, never truly accepting his absence. When Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901, she left specific instructions. She wanted Albert's dressing gown in her coffin, his photographs around her, jewellery he had given her. Even in death, she arranged to be reunited with him. Her funeral broke with tradition. She was buried in white, not the black she had worn for 40 years. It was as if she could finally lay down the burden of public mourning and return to being simply Albert's beloved wife. Victoria's legacy is complex. She transformed mourning from private grief into public spectacle. She made widowhood a form of identity that millions of women would imitate. The mourning industry, the elaborate rituals, the black clothing that defined an era, all of it flowed from her determination to make the world share her loss. She turned personal tragedy into cultural phenomenon. Her grief literally shaped how an entire civilization understood death, memory, and the proper way to honour the dead. What do we make of love so consuming? It stopped time. Victoria's devotion was absolute, unwavering, almost superhuman in its intensity. For 40 years, she insisted Albert remained present, vital, consulted on every decision. Her love became a prison, but also a monument. She proved that some bonds transcend death, that memory can be stronger than reality. Whether this was healthy or harmful, noble or obsessive, depends on how you understand the obligations of the living to the dead. Victoria's journey from vibrant young queen to living monument of grief reveals something profound about human nature. Love can elevate us or destroy us, sometimes both simultaneously. She chose to stop living when Albert died, but in doing so she created something eternal, a love story that still moves us more than a century later. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, consider what it means to love so completely that losing someone breaks the world. Sweet dreams.